Hello and welcome back to the EMJ GOLD podcast, brought to you by EMJ, your number one open access destination for HCPs and pharma globally. Hi Jade.
Hello Isabel, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
Very good, thanks. What have we got coming up today?
Well, for today's episode, I'm very excited to be sharing because it is on one of my favourite topics, which is women's health. And I was actually able to sit down with Mary Stutts, who is the CEO of the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association, to recently discuss some of the insights they discovered in a recent survey.
Yeah, some very interesting insights indeed, actually. They found that while physicians do recognise sex differences in disease progression and treatment responses, very few actually feel equipped to address them. So it's quite a worrying trend there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really keen to figure out why women's health is still so misunderstood in modern medicine. As that stat suggests, there seems to still be many biases in the space and a lack of gender and sex-specific research. So lots to get into in conversation. But before we do, should we get into a bit more about Mary?
Good idea. So as you mentioned, she's the CEO of the HBA, which, if our audience don't know, is the global organisation with a mission to promote the advancement and impact of women in healthcare.
Yeah.
So she's a leading voice in the industry and she advocates for inclusive leadership, representative workforces and health equity. So very noble cause there, and she's worked for the likes of Genentech, Bristol Myers Squibb, Bayer and others, so she has a huge amount of industry experience to share as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's also a very accomplished author, having published a few books. There's The Recurring Themes of Exclusion in the Workplace and The Missing Mentor, Women Advising Women on Power, Progress and Priorities. Those sound very interesting. I would urge you all to check them out. So yeah, it's a very big area of passion for her, which I think comes through throughout the conversation.
Interesting. Shall we listen in then?
Let's do it. Hi, Mary. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. How's it going?
It's going great. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Brilliant. Well, we are very pleased to have you on, as we were very interested by the recent survey that the HBA released with Fem Technology, I believe. And the survey was actually around critical gaps in women's health, something that most people will know a lot about. But I think this particular survey was very illuminating about how deep some of these inequities are, but also, you know, what some of the potential solutions could be. And I was really keen to talk to you about this research today and dig a little bit deeper, I think. Lots to unpack.
Absolutely. Yes, through our HBA think tank, we were able to do this survey that we released at Davos this year, where we looked at, we actually did two surveys. So we did one where we talked to women who work in healthcare, but then this particular survey was a survey of physicians, asking them how much they feel like they understand and are prepared to treat women's health care. We didn't talk to primary care physicians. We talked to specialists. We talked to oncologists, ophthalmologists, cardiologists, endocrinologists, and neurologists. And we selected them because we know that it's the specialists who are the ones who give people the option to participate, for example, in a clinical trial. We also specialists are the ones who prescribe the newest, most innovative therapies. And during my career, actually, during the time I was working at Genentech, I did the first diversity in clinical trials initiative in the industry. And the things that we found then for women, no matter what the race or ethnicity of the women, but for women in general and for people of color, we found that they are not receiving the option to participate in a trial and given the option to take the newest, most innovative therapies. And what is so upsetting to me is that here we are now, at least 10 years or so later, and it's still the same situation. But the interesting thing, again, is that we actually talked to the physicians to see if they felt like they had it under control. And it was a very illuminating survey because the physicians talked about how much they actually felt that they did not have the types of information they needed to be able to treat women effectively. They said they did not have the clinical data. They did not have the understanding of the hormonal impacts because hormonal impacts throughout so many stages of their lives. So they did not have those the impacts from a hormonal perspective, and they also did not have the impact from a diagnostic perspective. They did not have the tools and equipment they needed to actually be able to treat women. So that was very eye-opening to hear from them, and the frustration with those differences. So, it validates the data that we are seeing in terms of the gap in women's health, which again, we kind of known about for a long time, but the McKinsey study that was released at Davos last year really shone a big light on that with their study about the $1 trillion gap between women's health and men's health. And so the challenge is that all of the research that has been done on men, and even I say the finding solutions goes all the way back to medical school, because the medical textbooks are only done with majority male anatomies. Only about 10% of the anatomies in medical school textbooks are based on women, and less than 3% is based on the anatomies of people of color. So the physicians are not trained to even understand about women and the impact that that is having on women's health outcomes, but also the impact financially on the industry, that they are not realizing the business imperative for closing this gap for health. And that's why we're focusing on it. And the main point I want to make about that also is that women are the majority of the healthcare workforce. Up to 80% of the healthcare workforce in the U.S., and according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, is female. And if you look globally, 65 to 70% of the global healthcare workforce in the various countries is female, according to the World Health Organization. So because women are the majority of the healthcare providers, and by the way, the other statistic is that 90% of the world's caregivers, we mean people who are caring for their loved ones, paid and unpaid caregivers, 90% of them are women. So if these women are not healthy themselves, this puts all of our society at risk of not being healthy, because they are caregivers and the care providers.
Well, thank you so much, Mary, for kind of giving a bit of context around why you did the report and highlighting some of the key findings from it. Your passion for this topic is really, really clear. And yeah, it's amazing to hear just some of the things it uncovered. I would like to take it back to some of the specifics, if we could go through it for the audience, because I think some of the data that came out of it was really, really interesting. So the report reveals that while 80% of physicians recognize sex differences in disease progression and treatment response, fewer than 30% feel equipped to address them, as you kind of touched on there. Obviously, you brought in, textbooks aren't made for the female body. There's disparities between people of color being featured as well. Is it purely historical why we're still seeing such misunderstanding in modern medicine? Or do you think there's things that are going on even today that are causing this gap to remain unfixed?
Well, certainly we know that there's an amount of physician bias. So we know, again, from a lot of the work that I've also done from the health equity perspective and looking at why there are such major health inequities amongst the different populations, we know that, again, women and people of color are experiencing bias at the hands of the physicians. So what that means is, for people of color, especially women of color, the physicians are not listening to them. They don't hear them. They're not taking them seriously when they share their concerns about whatever symptoms they may be having, so that by the time the physician takes them seriously, and it could be over a period of years or longer, the symptoms have so progressed that they get worse outcomes. And the data proves that women are diagnosed later with diseases than men. So you look at, for example, breast cancer, even like triple negative breast cancer that adversely impacts women of color. The majority of them are diagnosed in stage 3, stage 4, or very aggressive cancer. So their outcomes are worse. Outcomes meaning they die sooner. And we need to be very clear what some of these things mean when we use our medical terms, when we say the outcomes are worse. And then when you look at white women, and I know there are a lot of nationalities that fit, but at the end of the day, what white women are experiencing, and film technology talks a lot about this, is that the physician thinks it's all in their heads, that they're imagining it, that these aren't real symptoms, but the outcome is still the same by the time they are diagnosed. Whatever the treatment is has progressed. Now, the other thing that's causing these worse outcomes is because we have made some progress with what we call the bikini diseases, breast cancer and cervical cancer and things like that. But the number one and number two killers of women, number one is cardiovascular disease. More women are dying of heart attacks. And guess what? They are dying in the emergency room, or they're sent home and die when they get there because the physicians don't recognize the symptoms of a heart attack in a woman. It is not the same as in a man. They're not having the chest pains and things like that. So the rate there, those diseases that are what we call traditionally male diseases, like heart disease, the cardiovascular disease, women are number one killer of women. Number two killer of women, lung cancer. And the majority of the women with lung cancer never smoke. Don't smoke, never smoke. So what happens is when you are doing your screening, checking in for your physical or whatever, if you check that you never smoked, but you have these symptoms, the physician is not going to take it seriously because they're just looking at, oh, well, she didn't smoke, because they don't know that this is the number two killer and the symptoms are probably different. So this is where women are literally dying because of, yes, physician lack of knowledge and understanding, but also physician bias. And so that is why you see, for example, with women of color, the very high maternal and infant morbidity rate. More of them die in child labor or right after childbirth because the physician is not as attentive and paying attention. And personally, it happened to me with my second child. My first child died of a crib death at 2 months old. And so obviously I was very reluctant about getting pregnant again, the trauma of that. But then when I got pregnant with my second child, me and the child almost died because I had placenta previa. And I told them when I got to the hospital, I'm bleeding. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's normal. Don't worry about it. Put me in and this was a top medical school hospital for women. So I'm not talking about I was at a community hospital or something. Put me in a waiting room, left me in there for a few hours before a nurse wandered in and said, oh, I'm just going to see how dilated you are. And when she pulled the stool up to the bed, not to be graphic, but her eyes got big as dimes when she saw all of that blood. And she started literally rolling the stool away from the bed. And she says to me, I'll be right back. And she did come right back with practically the entire floor with her, the nurses, the anesthesiologists, the doctors. It was like on the TV show where they pick you up and put you on the cart and literally run down the hall you to the operating room to do an emergency C-section. I had to have a blood transfusion. I'd lost so much blood. My daughter was jaundiced from all that time with losing blood. It was a horrible, and they just didn't listen. I told them when I came in, and they said it's normal. And my thing was, well, with my first child, I didn't bleed. I just, my water broke. I had the labor. I had the baby. They didn't listen. And this is what happens to so many women where the physician doesn't listen. So those are the things. And the other thing that I focus on from the health equity perspective is this whole idea of cultural humility, right? And it's not cultural competence, because that's the mistake when a physician or someone thinks I can get to this level where I'm culturally competent and I'll be okay. Well, you can't, because every person is different and their nationalities are different. And the way to be culturally humble is to listen to people, listen to what they say, pay attention to their symptoms. Don't assume, don't stereotype, and helping physicians to understand that, and the fact that their staff needs to understand that when you show up in the whether you're coming in for a routine appointment, or certainly if you're being treated in a hospital. So these are some of the things that the bias piece is huge, and it is definitely impacting women's health.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, particularly that story that you went through yourself. I think it's so important to reflect on individual experiences when it comes to issues like this, not just say women experience these challenges. I think, when you see it on a personal perspective, it becomes all the more impactful, and bias is such a challenging thing to break, but it needs to be broken.
It needs to be broken, but I also want to emphasize this is not limited to poor people, right? I mean, I was an executive. I understood the medical system and all of that.
Well, we were able to advocate.
Happening with women even beyond that. And that is also a big part of a lot of the cultural bias. I remember one of the organizations I worked for doing consulting before becoming the CEO of the HBA. And I would work with companies that were looking to enroll clinical trials, one, but also two, looking to launch their new therapies that now have been approved by the FDA, these newest, most innovative therapies. And when I would say, okay, so what's the demographic, what do you want to do about reaching diverse populations? What's the demographic you're looking for? And I was shocked how many of these marketing executives said to me, oh, yeah, we're going to do something for the Medicaid patients. And after a while, I finally had to say, do I look like I'm on Medicaid? Are you assuming that every diverse person is poor? We work, we have jobs, we have insurance, we can afford the copay. And literally, I had some of them looking at me like, oh, really? Oh, wow, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So our own biases too. So there's the physician bias, but there's the industry bias as well that is causing a lot of the negative impact.
Mm. It's interesting you bring up the industry there, because I suppose bias is also inherent, but is there a role for the industry to play to, I guess, help educate healthcare professionals, dismantle some of these biases, give them the tools to treat women more equally to how they treat men?
Yes, and that's a big focus. So that became a very big offering as a part of my health equity work in the practice where I was doing this for a firm, helping them putting together these types of programs around cultural humility for the physicians as well as the staff, but also for the research. It was the provider side, but also the biopharma side for clinical researchers and others. And especially when you look at designing clinical trials, the problem with the clinical trials is the way they're designed from the very beginning. They're not considering the obstacles or things that need to happen to make sure women and people of color are included in those trials. And so the protocols for the trials almost immediately exclude women and people of color. Now, to me, what is just so unbelievable about that process is that these same people who you are excluding from the clinical trial are the same people you expect to take your drug when it's approved. So yes, they may have a comorbidity or something, or yes, it may be a woman. It could be a woman who's still having menstrual cycles, or a woman who is in menopause, or whatever it is. You have to create some different arms of the trial so that you can study these subgroups, if you will, and get the data instead of just focusing on this very biased selection of people that you have for that trial and then force feeding the drug to everybody and then learning when you have the side effects and the problem. Um, th- and a lot of times that doesn't happen even until after the drug is on the market. And you see these negative outcomes for women and sometimes people of color. They're, our bodies are different. I love the Oriana, they had at FemTech, when she talks about it, she makes a very definitive statement that we have to make these days, which is women and men are biologically different. Hello.
It shouldn't need to be said, really, but there we go.
But we have to say it, and the data shows it. And the news is that physicians, like the ones we surveyed, are acknowledging it now, which is a huge breakthrough, quite frankly.
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the report. I felt that healthcare professionals themselves were acknowledging the biases that they felt and almost asking for help with it, which I think is a really positive step forward, as you say.
That's right.
I wanted to touch on briefly sort of some of the women's health conditions or conditions that have been most affected by the lack of sex-specific research. I mean, something that comes to my mind is obviously endometriosis, but I'm sure there's a whole host.
Yeah. So certainly the diseases that are more impactful to women, things like endometriosis, fibroid tumors, the different types of breast cancer, cervical cancer. Now, you look at some of that is country specific, like when we expanded into Japan, for example, and I went there and we hosted our events there and we did a leadership roundtable with policymakers and others. And that's where I heard for the first time the number one killer of women in Japan, in like young women in their 30s and 40s, is cervical cancer. And I'm thinking, how can that be when there is a vaccine for cervical cancer and the screenings, but they don't get screenings? Women there are not encouraged to get the screenings. There's such a stigma around women's feminine issues, so they don't even talk about it and they don't get the screening. So by the time they're diagnosed, the disease is too far progressed. So in that session with our leaders from our companies there who wanted to know what can we do to help advance women in our organization. And I do want to applaud our industry because they do recognize that they need women, that women are the majority. And that's one of the things why they work with the HBA. It's like, help us hold on to the women we have, but also help us build that pipeline. And so they ask, what can we do to help? And so, of course, it's first of all, promote within your company the information around prevention and screenings in terms of healthcare, which is something that happens quite frequently, certainly in the U.S. and other countries. So that's one. But two, cover the cost of the diagnostics, the screening. Women's diagnostics are so far behind men's diagnostics. So that is a big problem when you don't even have the tools you need to diagnose the disease. So that piece is very critical to look at the screenings, to look at the information that is out there for women to actually be able to be diagnosed. But then there are the other diseases, like I said, that are there are a lot of things that are hormone related when it comes to women. And, some of these things are kind of like taboo. So menopause, for example, do you know that in medical school, doctors get 1 hour of training on menopause in medical school?
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
1 hour. So, of course, they don't have any information. And it's only been in the last few years that there are even any therapies now for menopause because it was such a almost taboo topic. But when you look at advancing women in healthcare, you need to look at the whole length of their career because the older they get, actually, the more value they are to the healthcare industry because they are so experienced. You look at the fact that we have 5 generations in the workforce, and in the healthcare workforce especially. So you have Gen X, Y, Z, but you also have boomers are still working and pre-boomers are even still working because they're healthy. So the first chief health equity officer at Stanford, there were doctors and nurses who were in their 80s, still working. Nobody was trying to make them quit. You know why? Because they are so skilled and so trained. We actually, in healthcare overall, we don't have the workforce to replace a lot of these boomers and pre-boomers who are still working. So that piece is a huge piece of why we need to develop this workforce, and we need to invest in women. And when you look at, so the partners who did that McKinsey study last year that was issued at Davos met with me here in San Francisco to go over their data before we all went to Davos. And one of the interesting things that they shared with me was that when they presented the idea of doing this study to their partners at McKinsey, who were all men, said, why do you even need to do this study? You women already live longer than us men. And I know, right? It's like, well, but they had to say to them, yes, we live longer, but women actually have less healthy years than men. The times when women have their most health issues, please listen to me because this is so important. The time when women have their most health issues is when they are working. When they are younger, in the childbearing age, they are having challenges with fibroids and things like that we talked about, endometriosis, fertility issues. There's the biggest demand, right now for IVF among so many of the younger women. And then as they get older, and they are in these more senior level roles and more roles of responsibility, I always say they get set on fire with menopause. And so these are all challenges that happen. And then there are the increased health risks once women go through menopause. So this is why it is so critical to look at the entire trajectory of women's lives, because at the end of the day, the healthcare industry needs us, and it needs us women to be healthy and fully functioning, because the health, again, of society depends on us being able to do that. And that's globally. That's women all around the world.
Thank you for sharing that. Very, very interesting. And yeah, I think the more women we have in pharma, fundamentally, I think the further we're going to see women's health go and the better outcomes will hopefully become. It is a symbiotic process in that way. And I think we could do a whole podcast on women in pharma and building careers, but we will save that for another day.
It's not just pharma, by the way. It's women in the healthcare industry overall, because women work across the health ecosystem. That's why at the HBA, we're very focused on not only the biotech and the pharma companies, but the provider companies, the digital health companies, and even women entrepreneurs. Because one of the other things we found, we started doubling down on health equity, is that the majority of the health equity innovation is coming from women. And why is that? Because women have worked their entire careers in the industry all the way up. They kind of have a sense of what needs to happen, but their companies are not being funded at the same rate as men. So women's ideas need to be funded. That's why at the HBA, we hosted our first pitch competition for women-run healthcare companies last year at our annual conference in Toronto in September of last year. And we had over 70 companies, women-run companies from around the world that applied, and we went through and had it, and we selected a first, second place winner and an audience choice winner. And we brought in venture capital firms, ones that are run by women, that are funded by women, as well as our corporate partners who have investment arms in their companies, who help actually fund the prizes that we gave, prize money that we gave to those women. So that is another big piece that will help us advance women's health equity, but also a lot of these innovations that women are coming up with are positive for men and women. They are not innovations for women, and definitely need to be funded and can really make a dent in addressing health inequities.
Mm. And great to hear that the HBA is involved in that, as you are in many facets of the industry. I would recommend all our listeners to check out the HBA. I'm sure you have heard of them, but do check them out if you haven't already, because they do incredible work in this space.
Thank you.
We're nearly coming to the end of our conversation, Mary, but to conclude, we've obviously looked at the challenge at hand, looked at the survey and kind of what that revealed. But looking ahead, next 5 years, shall we say, what would progress look like to you? What would be some key changes that would perhaps signal we're on the path to things getting better?
Yeah. So I think the very first thing is we've got to close these research gaps in women's health. That piece is huge because these gaps still exist. And because they exist, the medical community, the medical providers have a gap in understanding and treating the many health conditions that impact women. So we've got to close that research gap and keep focusing on that. We also need to do a better job of understanding the impact of hormonal changes on health. So when you look at the hormonal changes experienced by women throughout, all the stages of their career and the lack of knowledge about the effects of those hormonal changes on their bodies, how it impacts diseases, how it impacts the disease management, even all of these things are really critical. And it also ultimately impacts the outcomes from the therapies that they may be given. So understanding these hormonal changes are absolutely critical. And then addressing the barriers to access and to the quality of care. So we know that there are a lot of cultural, socioeconomic challenges for women overall, and certainly for women of color, even more so. So addressing that and finding, more addressing these barriers and things like I talked about, the cultural humility, but also just even being aware of these things is critical. And, one of the things, just as a little aside, that I feel is that I think AI can help address some of these physician biases and stigma and stuff. I know that some people don't like that because I understand the risks and the challenges with AI because it can be biased in and of itself. But some of the things like when I was at Stanford, we were piloting the ambient listening in the exam room with AI, which now is a regular practice that they use. But the AI is in the room listening when the doctor is talking to the patient so that when they are done, the AI creates this summary of everything they said and adds in the recommendations that, this patient would be eligible for a clinical trial or for this new therapy, and puts it in the electronic health record. That is just phenomenal because the problem when the physicians don't listen to women and people of color and take them seriously is that their symptoms and what they're saying doesn't end up in the electronic health record. So some other doctor that they may go to doesn't even know that this was an issue, even in their own system, they may not know. So to me, that is huge. And then we can educate the patients because, that's the other thing. Everybody says, the patients have to become more health literate and all that. But most people don't know what that means. But to be able to say to the patient, one, ask the doctor the options for you. That is huge because they're not being given the options. But two, get a copy of your electronic health record. Get it on a regular basis. They have to give it to you if you ask for it. They're not going to give it to you if you don't ask. But then you can see if what you told the doctor is actually was put in your electronic health record. It's huge. So this is where I think the technology maybe can help with some of the barriers. And then just very quickly, as I mentioned, the preventative and the diagnostic solutions are huge. There's huge opportunity there. I know there are a lot of diagnostic companies springing up all over the place. Women themselves are coming up with them. So I'm super excited about that. And then the last point is personalized medicine. That was something we started working on during the time, it became a big thing during the time I was at Stanford, but it has grown even more so. So this whole idea of personalized medicine can really present unprecedented opportunities to develop targeted therapies, right, that account for all these the problems that women are having, and that will account for the women's biological differences. So that's a huge opportunity.
Well, so encouraging to hear that you see hope on the horizon, Mary, for women's health, especially that AI solution you mentioned. You can very clearly see how impactful that could be for empowering patients, but also helping physicians have the tools to deliver better women's health outcomes. So thank you so much.
There are a lot. That's one example, but there are quite a few very promising ones out there that I'm excited about.
Even better. Mary, it's been a joy to speak to you. You are so knowledgeable on this topic. Thank you so much for taking the time out.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, hopefully we are heading towards a future with improved outcomes in women's healthcare. That was a really good conversation. Have you got a favourite moment you could pull out from it, Isabel?
Oh, tons. I really enjoyed my conversation with Mary. From the discussion around the historical gaps in research, that was really fascinating, to clinical trials and the impact of physician bias. There was loads. So we really did cover an awful lot. I also, though, was really appreciative of Mary sharing her own personal experiences of being a woman in the healthcare setting. Personal stories really do impact in issues like this. So yeah, it was great that she was able to share that.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you there. Those personal experiences, they really contextualize things and highlight why change is so urgent. I thought it was really fascinating to hear about the innovations that are shaping the future, from those AI-powered tools to diagnostic advancements that are actually led by women entrepreneurs. There's so much potential to close those gaps. But as Mary did point out, it is going to take some real commitment from across the industry to really get there.
Absolutely. So much commitment needed, but hopefully a brighter future ahead. We want to thank you for listening today. Thank you so much to Mary for joining us on the show. And thank you to you, as ever, for listening.
Do be sure to tune in next week for another great episode. But until then, it's bye from us.
Bye.